Welcome to the Anxious Child Podcast, the podcast that helps you best work with anxious kids and teens. Now, here's your host, Stephen Quinlan.
Hello, everyone. Today on the show, we have Brian Sachetta. Brian is an author, a blogger, and a software developer from Boston, Massachusetts. Brian has put his computer science background to use both as a consultant and as a writer. His first book is called Get Out of Your Own Head and draws parallels between computer systems and the human mind and gives readers practical suggestions for overcoming anxiety. In our conversation today, we talk about Brian's experience growing up as a child and a teenager with anxiety and how this eventually led to a seminal moment in his life that caused him to go down his current path of trying to help others overcome anxiety. We also talk about masculinity in today's society and how this pertains to mental health. We cover panic attacks and how it might be helpful to use some of the concepts of computer science and software to help us conceptualize how our brain operates. It's a really interesting conversation with Brian's unique perspective, and I think that you will really enjoy it. But first, is the clutter in your house or your workspace causing you more anxiety? Mount Genie at mountgenie.com makes clever tech accessories and mounting solutions for your Alexa, Google Home, video game consoles, and all brands of Wi-Fi mesh router networks that can rein in that messy cord clutter in your home or in your office. Mount Genie also has organizational solutions for your keys, remotes, sunglasses, and more. Most install without tools in minutes and won't cause damage to your walls. Mount Genie is a family-owned company solving your cord clutter problems. Check them out today at mountgenie.com. One of the best things you can do to be healthy is to get the right amount of sleep. It's difficult to do, and oftentimes there are things that are beyond our control that might be keeping us up at night. But there is something that you can do which is within your grasp, and that is to make sure that you're getting enough magnesium. But don't run to the store to buy the first magnesium supplement that you find. Most of them only have the two cheapest synthetic forms. And since they're not full spectrum, they won't fix your magnesium deficiency or help you sleep better. There are actually 7 unique forms of magnesium, and you must get all of them if you want to experience its calming, sleep-enhancing effects. That's why I recommend Magnesium Breakthrough by Optimizers. Simply take 2 capsules before you go to bed, and you'll be amazed at how much better you sleep and how much more rested you feel when you wake up. For an exclusive offer for my listeners, go to magbreakthrough.com/anxiety and use the code anxiety10 during checkout to save 10%. All right, we're all set for our interview with Brian Sachetta. I think there's a ton of great takeaways here. I particularly enjoyed what started off as a somewhat off-the-cuff conversation that we ended up having about masculinity. Obviously, as a guy myself, there's a lot of things that I found of interest and value here, and I think our very definitions of gender, obviously, and how fluid that is these days, and particularly masculinity in general, are really shifting in some really positive ways, and it's great to see that happening. I'm just really excited to see a lot of that movement. So here we go. Here is me and Brian Sachetta. Enjoy.
Hey, Stephen.
Hey, Brian. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. Well, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here. Are you, you're in Boston, correct?
I am in Boston. Yep. South Boston.
Nice. How long did you grow up there, or how long have you been there?
Yeah, I grew up on the North Shore, a little town called Linfield. And then I've basically been here my whole life. I spent a year in Florida, a bunch of winters too, but been here a long time. So
you're a snowbird.
Yeah. Before it was, well, I guess my grandparents always did it, so maybe they instilled that in me. And
Okay.
now it's becoming super popular with remote work and all that. So some people say to me, "Hey, you've been doing this for a while now."
You're like a snowbird hipster. You were doing it like before it was cool.
Exactly.
Nice. You've got, I think, a really interesting backstory and perspective on anxiety, in that I know you do a lot of computer software development, and I'd love to talk about how you can look at anxiety and mental health through that framework, and almost from like your brain as being sort of a piece of software. But before we get into that, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what it was like for you growing up in Boston, and if you have any childhood memories of having anxiety and what that was like for you.
Yeah, definitely. I think to speak to the childhood aspect, I think for me, and it's always like everybody has their own things that they get anxious about, right? So for some people, it's social situations. For others, it's work related. It might be something off in the future, something a little bit more vague. It may be a specific task, whatever it is, right? Like some people get anxious about driving, something like that. For me, it was kind of always more in the social
Hmm.
category, right? So it was like I can think back as far as I can kind of remember, maybe like fifth grade. It was like, I have a presentation that I have to give to the entire class, and I'm 10 years old, and I'm terrified of thinking about doing that kind of thing, right? Or like I would be on instant messenger, and a friend and me we'd get into an argument, right? And I would like use a swear word or something. They'd be like, I'm going to tell the teacher, I'm going to tell the principal, whatever. And then the thoughts start going, the fear starts going, and then it's like I would spend all night in my bed being like, oh my god, like I'm going to go into school tomorrow and I'm going to get in big trouble, I'm going to get suspended, whatever it is, my parents are going to find out. So things around the social aspect of it, also obviously like maybe some punishment related things or whatever, but definitely can think far back into some examples of anxiety in my childhood. And then I would say it really, like, when you're younger, I think you can understand like difficult feelings, right? And you can say like, okay, I don't feel good about the potential of going to school tomorrow because I'm worried that I'm going to get in trouble or whatever it is. But I think until you grow up a little bit or just hear more terms, like I don't even know if you really know what the term anxiety means or being anxious, right?
Sure.
You might know the term nervous, right? I'm nervous to go to school, but like I don't necessarily know what anxiety is, and I don't know if there's a difference or what the difference is. So as I got older, I would say, especially in high school, like when you have these more prolonged periods of like feeling nervous all the time around specific events or whatever it is, then you start to say to yourself, like, there's a pattern here, right?
Hmm.
And so for me, it was in high school, going to school dances, asking girls out on dates, track meets, things like that. Obviously you're figuring it out as you go on the fly, but still I was starting to see like, okay, every day that I have a track meet, I am nervous for the entire day. Right. And then even days leading up to that for the next one, the same pattern occurs. So not that I necessarily figured out how to deal with that in high school, but you start to at least recognize the pattern, and that becomes at least the entry point into more discovery, maybe a little bit of healing, that sort of thing. So that was kind of my journey. Obviously, with the first book that I wrote, I highlight a lot of those different stories. Some of them coming in college. I have one that starts the book that was particularly relevant or pertinent in my life, which was basically I had been kind of seeing this girl a couple times in college, started to develop some feelings for her. She came over one night, and I could kind of tell based on the communication, like the text messages, that she had been drinking, I had not. Being an anxious person that I am, especially around social situations, intimate relationships, things like that, I was super nervous. Ended up having a panic attack in front of her, like while she was there. She did not handle it very well at all. She was, being not sober. She was pretty rude about it, and ended up storming off and calling me all sorts of names and whatnot. And that was kind of the one moment in my life that sticks out the most, of being like, wow, this is a problem for me. I need to now go figure out what it is and how I'm going to deal with it. Right. Before it was kind of like, yeah, it's frustrating, it's annoying, I deal with it from time to time or whatever it is, but I don't even necessarily know what this is. I don't know how to deal with it. This was kind of one of those line in the sand moments where you're like, okay, like we're done messing around, right? We got to get to work.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's like, well, there's a lot there in what you said. I think, first of all, the difficulty that kids have, they just sort of aren't able to do this, even when, especially when you're younger, of differentiating what emotions are, especially beyond that kind of, mad, sad, happy, like to drill it down into more specific areas that you don't really develop that capacity until you get older. So something like anxiety can feel very much like just I'm nervous, and a lot of those things are understood sort of retrospectively when you get older. Oh, okay, I now know what this term is. I now, and as you have done, found some ways to mitigate that or cope with it differently. Your story also makes me think of I don't know if you're familiar with, do you know Dan Harris? I think he does it's like the 10% Happier
Yep, I've
podcast.
read his book.
So yeah, so he had a panic attack on live TV, right, as the host of, I think it was Good Morning America or
Yep.
something. And it's like, and for him, that was one of those moments where he was like, okay, all right, sometimes life kind of forces you to start to deal with things that before you were maybe able to just kind of shove to the side. Is that so? That's kind of like what happened for you.
Yeah,
That was a turning point for you. What happened from there?
definitely. I think that's a good way to put it. And yeah, I've read Harris's book. It's a pretty good one. I actually watched the interview on YouTube
Me too.
of him,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's it's kind of it's interesting, right? It's like knowing what it feels like to go through anxiety. You look at that situation and you feel for him. You're like, wow, that must have
Mm,
been so terrible and so terrifying, right? And at the same time, it's interesting because it speaks to the idea that anxiety is, for some folks, it can be difficult to like understand, right? I think to somebody who watches that video, they kind of see a guy who's just sitting on camera, right? It doesn't
mhm,
look like anything is necessarily like out of place or whatever it is, right? And that it
mhm.
kind of speaks to the difficulty of anxiety. It's this feeling that you feel inside, right? It makes you see the world differently, even if folks outside of you or someone with a perspective other than your own doesn't feel that same way, doesn't see those same things, right? So it's definitely interesting, and yeah, I liked reading his work and looking at his website and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's akin to, I think, depression in a lot of ways, that it's not always readily apparent what's going on. And it's difficult for folks that haven't been through it to really understand that in a very sort of, I mean, obviously, if you haven't had the experience, you don't get that visceral understanding of like, oh, it's this, and my heart is racing and all these things. And that interview is a great example because you hear him describe it and you're like, oh my God, he must have freaked out and, ran off set or something, or
Right.
started breathing all heavy. And it looks more like he just kind of forgot his lines and then
Exactly.
had to
Yep.
go. They just like cut away from him. Um,
Yeah, and it's important. I think it's important to for us to just like remind listeners and just kind of put out there, right? Is that notion of the invisibility of these diseases, right? I
mhm,
write sometimes for a publication on the blogging website called Medium. The publication is called Invisible Illness, and it just really it captures the essence of that, right? When you're anxious, when you're depressed, like you would look at somebody and you might not have any idea as to what they're going through. So I think going through some of these things yourself makes you a little bit more compassionate in the sense of like understanding that somebody may be struggling with something and you can't, like, we might not necessarily be able to know exactly what that is or how it feels like.
mhm.
I guess what I'm talking about is like if somebody is going through a specific thing, right? Like if they got into a terrible car accident, like if I haven't been through that specific situation, I can't exactly know all the details of that, but I can know the pain associated with it, or at least with situations that are also painful, right? And I think that, again, it kind of helps us develop some compassion and understanding for some of the people going through similar things to us.
Is there anything you would say looking back on it now to either family members or concerned individuals or professionals that maybe were trying to help you in some way, that you feel like was helpful or wasn't helpful in that way? Like, did people make blunders, say the wrong thing, or have, because, not having that understanding, not going through it, I think it's very easy to kind of put your foot in your mouth.
Yeah, I think most of the professionals that I've dealt with, like when you have that experience, you have that compassion. And so that comes through. I think it's more what I'm kind of hinting at is more of like on the societal level, right? Like, we talk, like I talk a lot about masculinity and things of that nature, right? There's kind of a sense amongst guys to be like, hey, just like, grit your teeth and get through it, right?
Get
like,
over it.
Yeah, get over it, be a man, whatever it is. I think it's important for us to remember to have compassion for ourselves, right, and for each other. And again, it's tough to like rewrite any societal notions or messaging or things of that nature. But obviously, people, with the internet, more and more people are coming out of the woodwork, and there's more understanding as to what other people are going through. So I think it's a slow change. I think it'll eventually continue. It's going to keep going, and people will become more compassionate. But yeah, I would say if I had to, kind of speak to any of those people that I interacted with, it was kind of more around like specific people in your immediate circles, right? And I'm not calling anyone out specifically, just kind of,
Sure.
You would see it in high school, right? Like kids are mean to each other, right? And it's like, we don't necessarily know what somebody's going through, and they may say, oh, that's not a big deal, suck it up, or whatever it is, right? And that can be pretty hazardous for somebody who's going through something difficult.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you're doing that work with these guys. I think these notions of masculinity are changing a lot, really, even within the last 10, 15 years. And I think that as far as change goes, it starts in seemingly small places like, okay, I'm writing this blog, or okay, I'm, talking about this on a podcast or whatever it is. But there's momentum that's gained from that, and that eventually snowballs into larger change. And I feel like that there's some of that happening around the whole notion of self-care in general, and certainly around as men or boys even being able to that it's okay for you to do that. You can look after yourself, and you can be kind to yourself, and maybe not always be a jerk to your friends.
Right.
It is so common.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction to make. And I think one thing that I kind of think of in terms of like masculinity, right, is I think the old or the more traditional paradigm or notion of like masculinity is like, you don't think about your feelings, you don't feel them, you kind of push things down or whatever it is, right? Like, obviously that got us somewhere. I'm not really gonna think about or entertain or try to make sense of where that got us. But I think today the masculinity is evolving into a little bit more of like an understanding of like taking ownership for yourself, being responsible for yourself, right? Because if you think about it, right, I was actually doing some writing the other day, and I said to one of the things that I was writing about was like pushing your feelings down, not leaning on others, not listening to the things that are going on inside of you. Like, that's not what being strong is. That's not what being masculine is, right? Being strong, being masculine, whatever we want to call it, is like taking responsibility for whatever it is that we're going through, being strong enough to face the things that we're encountering, right? Being able to say, hey, this may not be in my control. It might not be my fault, but this is something that I'm going through, and I'm going to face this. And I'm not trying to like glamorize it, right, or romanticize it. It's more like I'm going to hear what's going on inside of me, and then I'm going to do whatever I need to do to deal with those emotions, get better, whatever it is. Even if, and when I say like taking a personal responsibility for whatever you're feeling, I don't necessarily mean like go out and heal your anxiety or whatever. It could be as simple as, hey, saying to yourself, like, hey, I know I need to go have a conversation with a loved one. I know I need to go book an appointment and get to the doctor and talk to a professional, something like that, right? So I think, at least in my mind, there's definitely some winds of change coming. I think masculinity is kind of evolving a little bit more into like taking responsibility for yourself, taking responsibility for others, being willing to confront pain, even when it's difficult.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it makes me think of some of like Brene Brown's work around vulnerability. And there's definitely that piece as well, that takes real courage to be able to put yourself out there and say, I'm feeling fill in the blank. And if it's not, the sort of John Wayne accepted emotions of either, I guess, rage, or maybe that's it. I don't know, that like, it's okay to feel those things too, and to take care of yourself as you're saying. Part of that too, I think also relates to obviously relationships with women or significant others, and how that comes into play. So thinking back to when you had this moment where you had the panic attack, take us through what happened after that. How did things start to change for you after that point?
Yeah. So, I'm in that moment. It's one of the most
Yeah.
painful experiences that
That
I've been
sounds
through.
terrible.
It's a terrible social
Yeah.
situation, snafu, whatever we want to call it. I
Yeah.
remember waking up the next day and just thinking to myself, like, I have this vision or idea of what college is supposed to be like in my mind. And just for listeners, I don't believe I said it earlier. This is like one of the first weekends of my freshman year of college.
Oh, really? Oh,
So
okay.
it's like, I sit down at my desk and I'm like, I was watching Animal House, and I have these ideas of like, that's what college is supposed to be like.
Thing.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Same
and
ideas.
obviously that's incorrect as well. But I'm sitting there and I have kind of this conflict in my mind as to what, almost like it's like a cognitive dissonance, right? It's like what I think college is supposed to be like and what my actual experience has been like thus far. And so I said to myself, I now have several examples of times when anxiety or nervousness or whatever I was able to call it at the time has held me back in my life, has made me feel really lousy, has led to situations that were not enjoyable, right? And so I sat down at my computer, and it was kind of one of those moments where I said to myself, like, I have to start dealing with this thing. I have to start figuring it out and trying to move forward. And so I remember, I recount this in my at the beginning of my first book. I remember sitting at my computer and being like, I'm not even really sure what this is. Like, I don't even know if I knew the word anxiety. I just knew that I was nervous. And so I started looking up different things online. I bought some ebooks. I thought they were actually pretty bad. I mean, at the time, this was 2008. So like the internet was not the same place that it is today. Obviously, Amazon was not like the biggest book retailer in the world. So there just wasn't as much content out there, that sort of thing. I think one thing that's interesting to tie into the stuff we were just talking about on masculinity, right, was like, I read a lot of things that basically said like, during that morning, it was like, a lot of the content would say like, you need to like stand up to your anxiety and like, face it and be like, the next time you feel nervous, you need to ask for more of it and be like, I'm a warrior. I'm going to fight through it, whatever. And it was like, when you're 18, like you're a sponge, right? You listen to all sorts of ideas, you pick them all up, you try them all out, that sort of thing. And so, I mean, not really having anyone that I could lean on in terms of like knowing somebody that had been through panic attacks and anxiety before, I was like, the people who wrote these ebooks, they had their own personal stories. And so these are my new role models for trying to figure out how to get through these things. So it was like, I would read their ideas because it was the only ones that I had at my disposal. And then I would put them into practice. And to be quite honest, it took me years of putting these things into practice before I realized that they didn't work, right? It was like, if you show up to an anxious situation or you're on a first date and your heart starts racing out of your chest and you're like, come on, heart, like race harder. Like I can take it or whatever. It's like, or fighting back against it. Like, no, that's not enough, whatever. It's like, just from a biological perspective, like when you're anxious, it's almost like you're hyperactive, right? And there's a lot of tenseness going on in your body. And when you react to that tenseness with even more tenseness, like, what do you think you're going to get? Right. And so it took me a long time to figure out that those strategies weren't working. And, I think in some ways it was like during that morning in college, I had kind of said to myself, it's funny because it's like, in some ways it was like, I said to myself, I wanted to figure this thing out and write a book on it. And in some ways it was like, who am I to ever do something like that? Right. But as I moved along with these strategies, it kind of reinforced my notion of like, okay, I'm trying all these different things out, which are supposedly, the cutting edge strategies in the industry or whatever it may be. And they're not working for me, but I'm finding other ideas on my own that are helpful. And so it reinforced my kind of personal story of being like, hey, when I feel like I have a pretty good grasp of this thing, I'm going to start blogging. I'm going to start writing a book, whatever it may be. And so, I could get into the details around that entire process, but it took a long time to unfold. And there are some more of those stories in the book. So that was kind of a high level overview of that sort of thing.
Well, you talked about, I read in one of your blog entries that you talked about seeing anxiety differently. And that sounds a lot of like what you're talking about, instead of trying to sort of smash it over the head and, kick its butt and take it down, a lot of what you described in that article was around understanding what its purpose is, which is primarily safety, and that, like, what can you take from it? So could you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think to speak to what you just mentioned around safety, right? I think it's important, like if we think about the human brain, right? Like we have the older parts of the brain that the brainstem and the amygdala and things like that, the emotional brain that are more centered around survival, safety, that sort of thing. And then we have, the frontal lobes, the more cognitive related parts of the brain. And so sometimes they're at odds with one another, right? It's like, okay, the older parts of our brain are super vigilant, trying to help us get out of difficult and unsafe situations, trying to get us to that safety, right? And then the more cognitive related parts of our brain are trying to override some of those things, right? So I guess where I'm going with this is basically like when we find ourselves in anxious situations, sometimes we find that those safety related parts of our brains are like on overdrive, and we have to use the newer parts of our brain, the cognitive related parts, to say to ourselves like, look, I understand that part of my brain is going haywire right now because it feels as though it's not safe. And just making that understanding, I can say to myself, it's okay that I feel that way. And it's not abnormal. It's not strange that I feel that way. And I'm going eventually these feelings will subside and I'll be okay. And being able to make that kind of that reassuring self-talk to ourselves helps us reframe that anxiety, right? See it a little bit differently. I think that's important in the sense that like, if you, it's almost like what you want to see is what you do see, right? So if you say to yourself like, oh my God, like I'm so anxious right now, this is not supposed to be happening. I don't know if I'm having a heart attack, whatever it might be. You cause those anxious feelings to proliferate, right? So obviously the opposite is true, kind of what I had just mentioned when you say to yourself like, look, I know I'm anxious. I'm not saying that this is comfortable. I'm not saying that it feels good, but I understand that it's a normal part of the way that my body reacts to certain things. It's okay. I'm going to get through it. You help yourself get through it quicker. I think that's an important distinction to make. I think another thing too, right, is like, so there's a study that I cite in my first book. I forget the author's name, but it was done out of Harvard. And basically this woman was saying that you want to put different labels on your anxiety. And so what she basically says is like, instead of looking at anxiety and saying that it's a message from your body saying that like you're really nervous about a specific situation or you're really scared or something like that, try to turn it around and say like, maybe instead of actually being scared here, maybe I'm like being energetic. Maybe my body is preparing me to bring a little bit more excitement to the situation that I'm going into. And one of the ways that I kind of frame this in my head, right, is like, there's some times where you're so anxious that you try to push it down and repress it a little bit, that if you show up to a social situation or the situation that we're talking about is social related, you can come off as like distant and kind of lacking energy and that sort of thing, because it's almost like you're letting all that crazy energy in your body like almost wipe you out, right? And that makes it so that you present yourself in kind of like an antisocial or non-fun way, right? But if you look at this energy in your body and you say to yourself like, this is actually something my body is trying to prepare me to be excited to go to this event, to come and be fully present and bring all my energy and that sort of thing, connect with people, talk to people. Then you can go and you can have passionate conversations with people. You can greet people with enthusiasm, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's a little bit easier said than done, but I think the notion or the framework of that sort of thing is important to be able to say to yourself, like, how I view this anxiety is the experience that I will ultimately get from it.
Yeah. I think you also, if I'm remembering correctly, I think you also used the example in your article of like a track athlete. If you are really nervous before an athletic event, what are you going to do with that energy? Like, are you going to allow that to sort of cripple you and make you not perform as well? Or are you going to harness it and take that and let it kind of propel you forward? It's almost like a judo of some kind, right? Like you sort of use that energy to flow with it instead of fighting against it, which, as you were saying, ultimately leaves you in sort of this tired out, disconnected state.
Absolutely.
Which is actually really ironically, I think that's a lot of the fear, is that you're not going to connect to anybody in terms of those social situations, that you're just going to be that dude who's over there and like no one wants to talk to him.
Yeah. And it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Where
Right.
it's
Yeah.
like, I'm afraid that I'm going to have this experience. And then by having those fears, I sort of send these messages off or signals off with my body. And then that becomes my ultimate experience. So, I'm not trying to be too woo woo there, but I think if you go through those situations with those mindsets, you do kind of come out on the other side and be it positive or negative, you say like, wow, like the frame of mind that I went into those situations with did influence the outcomes that I had.
Yeah, I mean it's law of attraction stuff. I mean, what you put out there ultimately comes back at you. I mean, you can look at that from sort of a maybe somewhat crunchy woo woo kind of perspective, or there's also neuroscience behind the way that you think and the way that you view the world. Ultimately, that becomes your experience, which is, it's empowering to know that you potentially have that much control over what's going on with you. 'Cause certainly in a panic attack situation, that's a lot of what happens, is it feels like there's a loss of control and you're at the mercy of whatever situation you're in, and you just get kind of snowballed by it.
For sure. And I think it is very helpful that there's a lot more science coming out as the years go by. There's a lot more people sharing their stories as the years go by. I think one of the interesting things about anxiety or about panic attacks is it's kind of that first panic attack that people have that really messes with them, right? Because it's this experience that it's completely novel. They've never had it before. They may even feel like they're having a heart attack. So It's just something that they've never dealt with before. Once you go through something like that, it doesn't necessarily make it any easier to go through another one, but at the very least you understand like, hey, I've been through this sort of thing before. I feel like I may be having another one of those panic attacks, even if it feels as though my heart is going to stop, like, or I'm not going to be able to breathe. That's not what's going to happen in the long run. I will get through this. I will be okay, even if it still is difficult to get through it.
Yeah, and that's that power, I think, as you were saying earlier, the power of naming what it is that's going on for you. Okay, I know what this is. I know this is anxiety. I know this is a panic attack. And that just right away takes some of the oomph out of it. Speaking of the neuroscience and everything, you also talk a lot about the idea of anxiety being a very forward looking part of your brain. So in that same way of trying to prepare for things that are coming at you and your fight flight system gets engaged. You also mentioned the idea of presence and how this can potentially mitigate some of that. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I do want to be careful with my words because I don't want to come off as like just saying, hey, just be present and you'll be fine or whatever it is, right?
Right.
All of these things are difficult to deal with.
Of course, yes.
And I don't want to make light of them.
Yeah.
But I will say that if you think about what anxiety is, right? It's a fear of the future, of things that are unknown, outcomes that are yet to unfold, right? And I say in the first book, like if you knew how everything in your life was going to go, I mean, number one, you wouldn't have to be anxious anymore because like the outcomes would be certain, right? But number two, you'd probably get a little bit bored, right? If you knew how everything was going to go, life wouldn't be so fun anymore. And I'm not saying that anxiety is fun. I'm just saying that there are, those uncertain outcomes, working toward a goal, working toward a goal and having it be one that we don't know if we're going to hit or not. That's what kind of makes it exciting, right?
Sure.
And so I think, speaking to the forward-looking nature of anxiety, it's like if we didn't have anything to worry about, aka if we knew how everything was going to unfold, there would be nothing to be scared of. Obviously, we can't get that, but one way that we can achieve something similar is to stop looking so much into the future, right? Stop going into our heads and saying like, oh, I'm so worried that XYZ is going to happen next week, or I'm going to this specific social outing, or I have this job interview or whatever it may be. And I'm worried I'm going to get laughed at. I'm going to be embarrassed, whatever it is. That the anxiety that comes about with that kind of thinking, or I guess to put it in a different way, like anxiety, even though there is a very real physical component to it, so much of it is mental as well, right? It's like if we just sit down and we think about things that are going to happen next week that we're scared of, we can create that anxious reaction like right here and now. And so it's like if we can prevent ourselves from going into those thought patterns, going into that place, then we can save ourselves some of the fear and anxiety that we may experience. Now, one of the ways that we do that is to become a little bit more present, right? Basically, all I'm saying by that is to not go to that forward-looking place in our minds, or that, looking into the future, asking ourselves questions about how things are going to go. Mm-hmm. And so, there's a million different ways that we could achieve presence, right? It's interesting because sometimes we do it without even realizing it, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, I remember in college, it would be like, I'd be sitting in class, one of my professors would be giving a lecture. If it was boring, I'd go off into my head, be thinking about all these different situations in my mind, really working myself up a wall over them, getting really scared, being like, oh, I don't know if this person is going to like me. I don't know if I have this interview for an internship next week. I don't know how that's going to go, right? And I'm thinking about all these potential problems. And then I would go to the gym. I'd have a great workout, and I'd leave the gym and I'd be like, wow, I feel pretty good right now. Let me go back and think about those problems that I was, ruminating over in class, because now that I feel better, maybe I'll be able to approach them in a different fashion. And one of the things that I found when I did that, obviously it takes time, and a lot of instances of that sort of thing is basically like, whenever you go into your problems, you bring those feelings back, right? It's like sometimes we can see them in different lights if we're in better states. But I think probably what is more likely to happen is the light that we see them in is one in which we say to ourselves, like, I don't want to deal with those problems anymore. I don't want to have to ruminate on them anymore. Like, they are not things of the present moment. And for that reason, I'm just going to put them down, right? And so we find that presence by engaging in specific activities. If it's going to the gym, you can kind of, I think you can deduce why, physical activity might get us out of our heads, right? It's like we're putting all of our focus, all of our energy into the run that we're going on, the barbell that we're lifting, whatever it is, right? Again, there's plenty of other ways that we can find presence. Some of them we do kind of just subconsciously. Some of them we can be methodical about. I think one that is always talked about in the media, and kind of going back to Harris's book earlier, is meditating, right? So sitting down with ourselves, finding a quiet space, and just trying to basically listen to our thoughts, and eventually listen to our thoughts, but not attach to them, and kind of just hear them as they move through our minds. And then instead of attaching to them, just kind of letting them float free, right? Kind of observing our thoughts without becoming emotionally attached to them. Just basically saying like, hey, here I am. I'm in this moment. This is what I feel. This is what I think in my mind right now. It's okay that I have that thought. Let it pass through my mind, just for maybe 5-10 minutes, whatever we may feel comfortable with, focusing on our breathing, trying to remember to come back to the fact that even though we have these problems that are in our heads, what's going on right now is we're sitting in a room by ourselves, on a couch, on the floor, whatever it may be, in a peaceful setting, just trying to remain calm. And so coming back to that present moment, right, getting out of our heads, helps us escape those thought patterns that create that forward-looking or future-looking fear. And I don't know. I think it's just, I think it's a helpful practice that we can adopt. There's all sorts of different methodologies by which we can do it, but it's kind of one of those things. It's hard for me to describe because it's like the whole ethos of my brand, right? It's like, get out of your head. What does that mean? Get out of those thought patterns, come back to the present moment, stop necessarily ruminating on fears of things that we don't even know how they're going to unfold yet. So,
yeah, well, I think that's well said. And I'm glad that you mentioned at the beginning that you don't want to come off as sort of flippant or glib about saying these things, because although there's a simplicity to what it is that you're talking about, being able to just drill down to, here I am here, I'm in this room, I'm breathing, I'm focusing on my breathing, that in itself, or, I'm focusing on my run or my exercise, whatever, can be so helpful. And it sounds so simple that I think there's sometimes a misunderstood implication of, well, just do that all the time, dummy. But of course, the reality is that it's also incredibly difficult. And the very nature of our brains is constantly trying to pull our attention away from that thing it is that that we're focused on. You can sometimes get into these things that I think are called now flow states, which are just, you're so engaged in what it is that you're doing that all of those other extraneous thoughts that usually are ramping up your anxiety are no longer there. And there's such a relief in doing that. But it's simple, but not easy. And so I find myself telling people that a lot, even in my own practice as a therapist, that like, look, this is the goal for you to just have in your head. This is what we're aspiring towards. That doesn't mean that you walk out of the office and boom, I've got this all set, because it's very easy to get down on yourself when what is, of course, a very natural part of the process starts to happen, which is you get pulled away from it again. I want to try to touch on, you mentioned sort of your brand, Get Out of Your Head, and that's your name of your book and the website and all those things. But I also want to make sure that we cover this idea of software, which is your background. It's such an interesting transition that you started out in that world and then ended up in this kind of mental health arena. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and maybe some of the connection between the way that computers operate and the way that we operate as human beings.
Sure. So I think, to give just a very quick background on my experience in computer science and mental health, I was always interested in building brands, building products, that sort of thing. That's why I got into computer science in college. And then I kind of just went down that path from a career perspective. Obviously, at the same time, I was going through all these different mental health battles. I'm trying to make sense of what I'm going through, that sort of thing. And so it was never really a methodical decision of hey, I'm going to specifically try to pair computers with mental health or whatever it is. It was kind of just, these are my life experiences. This is what I know and I understand. And this is how I'm going to try to make sense of things for myself and then also do the same for others. Right. So yeah, I had a podcast with somebody a few weeks ago and they had asked me it wasn't an attacking question. It was kind of just a curiosity thing. They were like, do you think that comparing mental health and computer science is the most effective way of getting the message across or whatever it is, right? And I kind of said I'm not really sure. It's all I can really say is that's my experience. That's how I know how to make sense of things. And I do think that given the fact that we're such a technologically advanced society these days, I think a lot of people can relate to it. Is it the best way of doing it? I'm not really sure, but I continue to go down that path because it helps me make sense of some of the things that I go through. And then, I think in some ways it also helps me. It helps me in both aspects of my career, right? It helps me understand the computer side a little bit better, and then it helps me understand the mental health side as well. There's a lot of different concepts that I try to bring out of computer science into my writings. I think the largest one or the most relevant one is this concept of the state machine. And so I got to get a little technical for a minute.
Okay.
So a state machine is if you think about a computer program, right? Uh-huh. A state machine is the concept that the way that computer program runs or executes its the different things that it does is based upon the current state that it's in. A state, it's kind of hard to describe, but it's kind of just a way of describing the current position, the way that things are lined up, the way that the data falls, or something like that, right? So what I use as an example is even just an actual computer, right? So we have a computer may be in the on state, right? It may be turned on, powered up, whatever it is. It may also be in the out of battery state where there's no battery left in the computer. It may also be in the turned off state where there's actually battery there's actually power in the battery, but we decided to turn it off. And so the state machine is kind of this concept that the computer itself is going to run differently, or the computer program or whatever it is, right? It could be a video game or something like that, is going to execute differently. It's going to run differently based upon that state that it's in. And I think it's a helpful concept to have, because once we understand what it is, we can use it to model all sorts of behavior, right? In my one of my introductory computer science classes, we talked about basically we built a bubblegum dispenser, a bubblegum machine. And so you're saying to your, what you're trying to do is you're trying to take some real world object and say hey, these are the different capabilities that it has. This is the way that it functions in specific scenarios. So it's if somebody turns the crank of the bubblegum machine, but didn't put a quarter in it, then that machine is going to say like, hey, I'm not going to dispense you a piece of bubble gum. And so I think one of the important things to do is to be able to say to ourselves, and again, I know that I'm going kind of fast and it's a little technical, but I think taking that concept and saying to ourselves, when we are in different mental health related states, so an anxious state, a depressed state, understanding that we may act and think and feel in different fashions, and then being able to understand like what are the most effective ways of acting in spite of those states, or figuring out how we get from one state to the other, because a state machine is basically this map that says, hey, here are all the different possible states. Here's how we act when we're in them, or here's how our computer system acts when it's in it. And then here's how we get from one to the other. And so it's difficult work. I mean, I'm not even going to, it's also a little bit nebulous, right? It's hard to really pinpoint our own behavior and say, if I do these specific things, I'm going to get from this state to that state. But I think it's an important concept that allows us to say to ourselves something like, hey, when I'm anxious, I tend to see things in a less hopeful light. And because I do that, then I'm less willing to go hang out with friends. And then when I'm less willing to hang out with friends, I feel more anxious because I say to myself, like, hey, again, I want to say this cautiously, like I'm not trying to be glib or whatever, but I may say to myself, like, I'm a loser because I can't even hang out with my own friends, right? And then that may lead me to a depressed state or whatever it is. So it's kind of just developing this awareness of what we do when we feel different ways, and then allowing ourselves to say, like, make the recognition of like, when I feel this way, I do these things and it leads me to this. And then being able to turn that behavior around, change it methodically, whatever it may be, say to ourselves, like, I'm going to stop myself from going back into my head and ruminating because I know that that's something that I do when I'm anxious. I'm going to instead replace it with some other behavior that helps me get to a different, more empowering state.
Yeah, it's like recognizing, as you're saying, where you are and what it is that's going on with you, as you were saying earlier, kind of giving it that name, but also knowing that when you're in that state, emotional state, mental state, whatever, that you're constrained a little bit by the place that you are, just in that same way. As far as technologically speaking, there's only so much you can do. If your battery's low or the thing is turned off, there's certain things that just aren't going to fire at that point. So how do we move ourselves out of that place into another place that might be a little bit less limiting, less kind of constricting? That makes a lot of sense. So tell us a little bit about how did you get to, so you were doing all that kind of research, and how did you get to this place where you wrote, I know you're working on a second book now, but your first book that came out, which is Get Out of Your Head. And how did you go from an 18-year-old who's furiously researching in his dorm room to actually cranking out this book that's now out there?
Yeah, I mean, it took a long time. I think in some ways, like I know that my own behavior or my own strategy or methodology for writing things is like, I will just be out in the world and I'll have ideas come to me. And I'm not saying it's not like a magical thing. It's just like I'm walking around. I'm like, oh, I saw something that reminded me of XYZ. I take a note on my phone, I write it down, and I kind of distill all these ideas down, or I write them somewhere that I have access to them. And then after enough time goes by, I'll look at them and say, like, oh, I have enough content here that I can do something with it. So that was kind of that was really how the first book came about. Was like, basically I would just take notes for myself based on how I was feeling or things that I did when I was anxious. And after enough time, I looked down and I was kind of like, I have a lot of content here, right? And I would talk to different folks and I would say, hey, these are some of the practices that I developed, some of the strategies that work for me when I find myself being anxious or whatever it may be. And, I was always interested in writing something or doing something with my content, even as far back as when I was 18 in college and going through that anxious moment with the girl that I was interested in. I always said to myself, like, hey, once I figure out what this is, I would like to, write a book, write a blog, whatever it may be, share some of this content. So the idea was always kind of in my head, but you kind of, you have different experiences on the path or on the journey where you're like, you forget about maybe writing a book for a little while, then you come back to it or whatever. And so, I would go out with different people. I would talk to different people at work, friends, whatever it may be. And I would share some of these notes with them and they'd be like, wow, this is good stuff. Like, have you ever thought of writing a blog, writing a book, whatever it may be? And sometimes I would listen, I would take what they said and I'd say, you know what? Thanks for reminding me. Like, I got to get back on that. Right. So after enough time, and it was years of note taking, there was kind of just this one moment that I also describe in the book where I really said to myself, like, I sat down, I wrote down 10 specific ideas. I call these the 10 steps to getting out of your head. I detailed that in the book. It's kind of a framework for like walking back in the moment anxiety. And I looked at these notes and I was like, hey, again, I probably haven't mentioned this yet, but when you take these notes, they're a little bit rough at first, right? You
Sure.
start with something that is not quite refined, and when you're moving to an artistic piece or whatever, you have to make a little bit more sense of it, clean it up or whatever. And so in the book, I talk about how I wrote these things down, and then I said these are the 10 steps. I think in the moment I probably wrote 12 or something like that, and you have to pare them down, clean them up a little bit, whatever. But long story short, ended up taking all that information, sat down. I think I started in 2017 and just cranked the book out over several months, kept editing, ended up releasing that at the end of 2018. At the same time, I have been, during that time as well as now, I've been working on various blog posts that are on getoutofyourhead.com. And then, as you mentioned, working on a second book now, which is actually, I haven't shared a lot of details with anyone. I'm kind of keeping it close to the belt, but that is going to be called Get Out of Your Head Volume 2. So instead of anxiety, this one is going to be about depression. And I don't have a release date yet, but it is coming along. So it should be out fairly soon.
Well, it sounds great. The creative process is certainly an interesting one. I think that there's a misconception sometimes that, as you were saying, these ideas just kind of come out of nowhere and you just sort of pluck at them. And while that does happen in some serendipitous sort of moments, there's a book called The War of Art. I don't know if you're familiar
Yeah, I
with
actually
that.
love that book. Yeah. It's Stephen Pressfield?
something. That sounds right. I know he has the same first name as I do. That's about it. But having also cranked out a book recently myself, I know that it's
Congrats.
oh, thanks. There is a dedication that you have to really bring to it, which is you got to sit down every day and just sort of do what it is that you can do. And there's a patience that comes with that process too, that anybody that's ever written a book or certainly even blog posts sometimes, that you have to just kind of let it marinate for a little while and then come back to it. So congrats on getting your first one out and working on your second one. And
Thank you.
I also just want to say that as we were talking about earlier, I think that these things that you're doing around mental health, certainly masculinity, all of those things are, it's a service that you're putting out there to the world. And I just think that that's wonderful. And hopefully that things that you're doing, this podcast, even that in some way can contribute to helping somebody somewhere. And it's just such a nice feeling to be able to try and be part of that in some way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that there is enough negativity in the world, enough.
I think we've got that covered.
Yeah, we've got that one covered. So to be able to uplift someone, inspire somebody, help somebody get through a struggle, like I don't know if it's the right word, but it's humbling, right? People reach out and they say like, hey, I read the book, I read the blog, whatever it is, this helped me. Like, that's why I do it. And so, obviously this was a great conversation and hopefully we can help folks with it as well.
Yeah, I hope so too. All right, that was Brian Sachetta. His book is called Get Out of Your Head, which you can find on Amazon, and his website is getoutofyourhead.com. Thanks so much to Brian for coming on today. A quick reminder to everyone, if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on iTunes. You can also support the show by checking out our sponsors, Mount Genie and BioOptimizers, and using the code Anxiety10 for 10% off at either one of those places. You can also check out the website, theanxiouschild.com, if you're interested in individual coaching with me or just to support the podcast in general. And as always, I would love, love, love to hear from you. If you are listening to the show and you have any questions or comments, you can get in touch with me via the website or on Instagram at The Anxious Child Podcast. So that's it for today. Until next time, take care and be in touch.
This podcast is not intended as medical or psychological treatment. In no way should it replace treatment from a mental health professional.